starting late. So I wanted to start off really quickly and just, so we don't have Ramiro with us today, but we have Jared with us. So we've got at least one professional software developer on the lesson today. And so wanted to do a couple things. First, just wanted to go around and see where everybody's at on the Hardle tutorial. And then what I thought is the next thing is if people have any specific questions, you can ask, and maybe one of the guys here who have gotten further already in the tutorial can answer it, or Jerry could potentially answer it as well. And then the last thing I wanted to do is we may finish up early if this ends up not taking a long time, but I thought it would be helpful to just go through kind of a list of some like really big picture ideas that we get thrown at us all like one after another in the first couple chapters of the Hardle Ruby on Rails tutorial, and just talk through them. A few of them, maybe I'll talk through my understanding, which I'm hoping will be helpful because my understanding is not very advanced, but I've gone through it a few times. And then a few of them I'll just immediately defer to Jared or to any of you who are have more experience than I do. So starting there, and then maybe we can start over here with Alan. Just wherever you're at, whether you're still just starting or gotten to partway through one of the chapters.
So I finished chapter 2. So yeah, I
was
finished with the toy app.
Right. Okay. Finished chapter 2. Done with the toy app.
I finished chapter 1, starting chapter 2.
Okay.
I finished chapter 5. I'm on 6 now.
Okay. I'm in the same place, Alan. I'm just finished chapter 2 so far.
Stuck right now on chapter 7.2.
Okay, 7.2. Diego?
So I just finished chapter 1, moving on to chapter 2.
Okay. Yeah, and we, well, Jared, go ahead. You've also been looking at it too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going through it. I'm in the middle of chapter 2 right now.
Okay. Yeah, so as we talk about this a little bit more, everybody feel free to, I mean, it's great. The more questions you ask, the better, because we all have very different backgrounds. I mean, like Jared studied computer science in college, all the way down to like me, like, what do I know? Some of you guys have had more training in Ruby as a language just through Code the Dream. Some of you have done a little bit more work on apps using Rails. So, and some of you haven't done as much of either. So definitely speak up if you have any questions. So does anybody have any specific questions so far? Like, is anybody stuck, or there's something that's not working as you would expect currently in your app, or where you're at in the tutorial? We may or may not address it right now, but it would be good to hear if anybody is stuck.
I'm just finding some of the gem files that I don't have, so I'm constantly having to run bundle install for new gems sometimes.
Oh, wow.
As you go along further, you'll start seeing certain gem files I don't have on my system right now. You have to keep going in and updating your gems.
Right.
So that's kind of frustrating, but still learning a lot just going through Stack Overflow, figuring out other people that have the same issue.
Right. Okay. So that, I don't know how well the mic is picking up everything, but Rondell was saying having some issues in the later chapters with having to add additional gem files that weren't already installed for him.
Right.
Is that something that's usual, that happens often, or is it rare cases where that happens.
I mean, I don't know if, like, I haven't gone that far in the tutorial yet. So leveraging gem files for function and adding more and more in should be a common occurrence. Or reusing somebody else's code. Like, I think the very first lesson I learned in computer science from one of my first professors, and he was being a little bit sarcastic, but there was a point behind it, was a good programmer is a lazy programmer. And what he was trying to get across was don't rewrite everything. And that's what gem files really help you do, is you're not rewriting code that somebody else did most of the time. But I don't know if your specific case is just because we're adding in more and more function, and so you need to add these gem files, or maybe there's something wrong with a gem file not importing its own dependencies, which I would expect to work correctly, because I'm pretty sure gem files can have dependencies on other gem files, and those should all be imported when you like bundle install one of them. They should install as well.
Right.
Makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. And you're seeing this in like chapter 7, for instance.
Yeah, and
where
it's
you're-
making sense because you're adding new attributes to the page. So
Right.
I get what he's saying about is you're adding more functions to it. You have to acquire more gem files. So it's making sense.
Right. I also wonder, it seems like it might be possible, because you've been doing the tutorial over a period of time, right? I imagine it's possible that there are things where he changed the way he did them and maybe used a different gem, and at the point where you followed his instructions on your initial gem file, maybe he's changed it since then. I have just another possible theory, but in either case, yeah, I mean, we'll talk more about debugging in a little bit, but it's awesome that you're able to kind of work some of that out. Anybody else? No? Okay. Yeah. So while we're talking about gem files, does everybody feel like they understand what gem files are? What gems are? Yeah. Well, so so even though nobody has any questions about it, we're recording this too. So for anybody who's less familiar with Rails, Jared, I know you can talk more about this, but as Jared was just saying, so gems are specific to Ruby, and they're essentially packages. We only call them gems in Ruby, but they're packages of pre-written code, and at least the good ones, many of them, the ones that we're using, you can basically assume that someone has already done a fairly good job of writing this package of code that usually better than we could do, even if we were writing it from scratch. So it's a really great asset to be able to pull those in and use them for our program. Jared, anything else about gems or packages generally?
No, it's pretty much you could think of gems as just a zip file of Ruby code with a few other files that are like metadata information about what's in it. And not just what's in it, but what its dependencies are. You know how in our project we have the, let me get the name right, the gem file itself, which specifies our dependencies, the gems that we need. Each one of those gems will also have something like that will say this is what it needs. So when you go and install, it'll install a whole bunch of other little zip packages of really functional code.
Right.
That's really what you're doing with gems.
Right. And so, I mean, so we'll see throughout the process of this app or many apps, you'll see that the gem, we've got HQ Raleigh in the house.
It's just me. Well, okay, there too.
Can you guys hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. We were just going through, we were talking a little bit about gems, all the things you can do with gems, like within using Ruby on Rails. You can go through and use like devise as a super common gem that will probably learn about a little bit later that allows you to have users and logins. And I mean, there's gems to allow that will help you with the styling to make your app look good. There's gems for testing to make sure your app is going to work under all the conditions you want it to. So super valuable concept. Anybody else have any questions about that?
There was a question earlier about bringing in Python again.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know who was looking for that information. I wasn't sure.
Is there anybody?
Oh, I did. I asked that question.
Okay.
About Python?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not something you would really do because since they're different languages, they use different interpreters to convert them down to machine code for each platform. So you can't just like convert your syntax over to Python and have it run in Ruby because it wouldn't understand how to interpret it. The languages will have different support for functionality and stuff. But there do exist times when you might want to do something like that. The specific instances I could think of would be basically two major times when you're trying to use a different language or maybe do some Python in Ruby or something like that, and there's might be a tool that lets you explicitly say, like, this is a block of Python code, treat it differently. The two major instances I can think of when you'd be wanting to do that would be if you have a large code base in one of the languages, like let's say you have a large Python code base and you're trying to convert to Ruby, you might want to be able to have some Python code embedded in Ruby or some Ruby code sort of embedded in Python so that you can move the languages or switch over to another language, or the other way around. And the other reason you might want to do that is just like Ruby has a large collection of gems, these bundles of Ruby code that let you do something. Python has a large collection. I think they're called pips in Python. And there might be a case where, oh, there's this fantastic piece of Python code that really solves my problem, but I've written everything else in Ruby, so you may need to somehow bridge between the two. But other than that, you wouldn't be just using Python syntax in Ruby or something like that.
Yeah, it was just still curiosity question, you know. But then I figured that you already
yeah,
there's no point like using the Python. Sense.
Okay. So now what we were going to do is we were going to go through and just take a step back and talk about some really kind of basic, bring up a whole bunch of basic questions or basic ideas that have kind of been thrown at us in the first couple chapters of the Michael Hartle Ruby on Rails tutorial. Because basically, for those of you who maybe didn't read the intro that carefully or something, you know, what he basically did in this tutorial is he takes you through in the first chapter and he just has you do Hello World app, right? I mean, very, very basic app to introduce us to some really basic kind of fundamental concepts. And then in the second one, he takes us through and has us create a more functional app, but just to do it really quick and dirty, and we'll talk more about how he does that. But because he does the whole process there in chapter 2, he kind of forces us to think a little bit about tons of different ideas, right? But he doesn't really, he just keeps saying over and over again, oh, we'll explain this later, right? And that's one of the great things about this tutorial is he does give you this big overview and then comes back to do it again later. And then, so the way it's structured is then by chapter 2, you've already technically you've written 2 functioning web applications already, one each chapter, the Hello World app and then the toy app. And then and then chapters 3 through the end is where it basically shows you how to do all that, but like from scratch, not taking any shortcuts, and do it in a way that you could use for just about any web application you might think of. Certainly any of the common ones. Like you could basically use it to develop Twitter or Pinterest or Instagram or whatever it is you're looking to do. So I wanted to take a step back then and look at some of those concepts. And I'm going to try to switch the, well, on this one I'm not sure how I do it. Try to switch my camera so that you guys can see the board back here a little bit better. So the big ideas, and these are just, feel free to add other ones if there's something that's confusing. But the ones I wanted to start with are these right here. Just some really big picture ideas, and want people to jump in if they have questions or thoughts. And just wanted to take however long it takes us to run through them. I mean, I hope you guys do have some questions or thoughts on it. But if we do it fast and nobody has any questions, we'll just finish early and come back, have a more kind of regular class next time. So the first really big idea, because everybody's starting from very different points, is this distinction between, okay, we talk about Ruby on Rails, but wait, what is Ruby and what is Rails? And the way, I'll tell you the way I think about it, and then like Jared or Ruben, one of you guys can correct me if I say something inaccurate. So Ruby, is a programming language like Python or C# or C++. It's the language. It's one of the languages that we will be using in these applications in the tutorial, and it happens to be the language in which the entire framework that we're using, which is Rails, is written as well. So the way, among other things, the way I think about Rails is one of the hardest questions when you're developing, when you're creating any complex program, is you've got all these different files doing all these different things. So how do you know where to put them? I know, Ruben, I don't know what you think about it. People I've talked to who've done a number of different coding academies, and even people who've done a computer science degree in college, but they haven't done that much web development. It seems like often the biggest hurdle is like, wait, I know how to do any one of these things individually. I know how to set up a file that puts new users in a database. Yeah. And I know how to make things look pretty on a particular page. But where the heck when I'm building a whole application, where do I put all that stuff and have it all talk to each other and work properly? And so Rails is basically generating this framework, the structure that allows you to do that. And so a big part of what we have to, if we want to be web developers, we want to be able to create our own apps. And this is really in any, like whether they're mobile apps, web apps, whatever, is learning how to use the various frameworks available to us, in this case, Rails. I don't know if that's something, have you found, is that something that you found to be a big challenge?
Yeah, definitely in the beginning.
Jared, do you have any other thoughts on Ruby on Rails and how for people who are like, wait, I know we did some basic problems in Ruby, what does Rails really mean?
Right. I think you did a good job of capturing the core of it, which is it helps you lay out a whole bunch of pieces all over the place that you're going to need to build a more complicated application. A couple other big benefits from using something like Rails is built on the existing knowledge of people who have built web applications. So Rails sort of takes a lot of best practices that people learned from trial and error, from doing it and finding out, oh, it works really well if I put something in this location, or I have this data structure, or my application is structured this way, and turns it into a framework that helps you build using that approach. So instead of having to learn all of those things yourself, if you try and build it from scratch, you're once again using all the knowledge of the people who have put the Rails framework together to speed that up. As both its pros and cons, right? Because you may not, as a result of that, you may not fully understand the reason for all of the structure decisions that Rails makes when you're doing it, because you haven't had to learn those lessons the hard way, the way that a lot of the people who built Rails have had to learn them the hard way.
Right. Anybody else? Anybody have any questions about Ruby or Rails and Ruby on Rails? Big concept questions. Like, for instance, if you've ever used, if you've taken a basic class in another language, is there anything where this just doesn't make sense compared to how that other language works? No? All right, we're good then. Another really basic point. Does everybody feel good about using the terminal, what the terminal is versus your text editor, and kind of the role of each?
Could you explain what a terminal is?
Yeah, so let me see if we can, again, try to share the screen here. Sorry for not being better at Hangouts. So down here, so here we're looking at Cloud9, this online computer. You can basically think of this as a computer that lives online, and we're using Cloud9 in this tutorial because it allows us to all be, essentially, it's like we're all using not only the exact same computer or type of computer, but most importantly, the exact same kind of operating system, and it takes out a lot of the individual things that can create errors and different messiness between what happens when we write the exact same code on different machines. And so here within Cloud9, the way it's set up, which is a very helpful way, but it's not exactly the way it would always be when you were just programming on your own machine, is so you've always got the default setup. You can switch it around, but you've got the terminal down here, and you can create new. Oh, actually, I'm not going to mess around with it too much because I'm doing a terrible job with the Google Hangouts. But you've got the terminal down here where you would choose to write commands to interact with that computer itself. To, like, you can change between different files, go into one file, and you could start, for instance, you can start running a server from here, a local server. Basically, you can think of the terminal as how you're interacting with the computer generally. It's almost like it's a non-visual version of Windows, kind of. Whereas the text editor is this part on top, which is where you're opening up individual files from your entire application structure here, and you're writing the individual files that will then compose your entire app. So you might be in a particular file that is adding in a views file that's showing what a particular page will look at, and you might be using a little bit of HTML in there, for instance, or CSS. You might be in another file that is just dealing with the database structure. Does that make sense? Anybody want to do a better job of explaining terminal, the terminal versus text editor, and then we'll talk in a minute more about general structure. No? Okay. Now that we've all been enlightened by that wonderful discussion. So another thing that we wanted to talk about that is, again, to me at least, gets at the heart of what one of the single most difficult things in getting good at creating web applications is the app file structure and MVC, the model view controller type of structure. Somebody else want to give a shot at explaining generally the file structure of a web application in a language using a framework like Rails? Oh, come on, guys, it's so simple, right?
I'm giving a yes.
Yeah.
I guess you can look at the files as like they hold different components of the program you're planning on making. Like you might find a folder that shows the views of each page. You might have a folder that has the certain gems for you to allow certain buttons to be available on the page. They just hold different components in small parts of making the whole program work together and the different pages work and linking pages to one another.
Right. Yeah. And then, Jared, you want to give us your spiel on MVC, like how that structure, how it works.
Yeah. It's a pretty complicated topic in general, and there's a lot going on. But the gist of it is, it's a way to break a program up into logical pieces so that everything isn't spaghetti code. Spaghetti code is a term for, imagine a plate of spaghetti, literally. And spaghetti code is code where all of the bits and pieces of code are so intertwined that you can't like take one piece out and work on it or change it without affecting everything else. So model view controller is just one way to try and build an application, typically a web application, that will help you hopefully write code that has less of that spaghetti nature where there's sharp dividing lines so that it's easy to change one piece of the application without having to change it everywhere. So the way it accomplishes that is by splitting your application into three big, broad pieces conceptually, and those are, in the name of it, you've got the model, the view, and the controller. So your model in a model view controller architecture is just the data that you have. Imagine an Excel spreadsheet or any database or whatever. It's just sort of that collection of data that you have. Now that Excel spreadsheet of data doesn't really give you a nice way to see that data or to visualize what's going on. It's just the information that you have. So that's sort of what the model accomplishes in a model view controller. Then you've got your views. Those are really the different pages on a site, at least in Rails. But you can have different types of views that aren't pages on a site. You could have a text file view that outputs to a text file or something else. But a view, or even you could have different views for the same information on a web page because you might want to see it maybe in a table that lets you scroll through the data, and then you might have a view that lets you see it as charts. So those are sort of ways to view that information. But if you had taken all of that data and put it together with that view, well, then you'd end up like duplicating the data when you created another view to see that data differently. So separating those two out is a way to be able to reuse data with different ways of seeing the data. And then the controller is sort of the glue between the two pieces that helps you figure out, or helps the application figure out, okay, this view needs certain information and takes certain actions on that information, but we don't want that view too directly tied to the model in case that changes. So the controller is sort of the mediator between the two. It goes and gets information from the model, sets it in the way that the view needs it, pulls in the view and adds it together, and then gives you back a view with the data rendered that way. And then if the view needs to take an action, like you need to update somebody's username, that's handled through the controller typically also, where like the view basically tells the controller, oh, hey, I've changed the username, go ahead and change the model in some way that matches it. So you've got those three pieces. The controller's a lot of the glue between the models and the views, and the biggest goal for that whole architecture is so that you can change out the pieces pretty easily.
Great. Yeah, I think that is, I think that's helpful because Michael Hartle in the tutorial, he talks, even just in the first two chapters, he talks about MVC, I think 2 different times. And for those of you guys should, I encourage everybody to look at, go back and look on Slack or just search on YouTube for the Hartle Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the one chapter where he's provided for free just the full like 39-minute video of him talking you through all the concepts in Chapter 2. And he does, there in the video and in the written format, he does a pretty good, I mean, a great job of talking as in just very short terms what MVC means in terms of this particular app. But I actually think that in some ways what Jared just said in a couple minutes gives you a little bit more of a glimpse into why we use that type of structure in the first place. Because at least at this point in the tutorial, Hartle doesn't get into that at all. He just points out that you've got these different sets of files, and in this particular app, this is what kind of gets pinged first, and then that controls this and goes back to this. And so when you look at your file structure, you guys will all be able to see that you've got these higher level folders. You've got your controller folder, you've got your models folder, and you've got your views folder. And most of what we do throughout the course of the application development process will, just about anytime we're like adding a big piece of functionality, we'll be making a change. We'll have to be doing some work in all 3 of those sets, right? So I know later in the MVC and the file structure is super complicated, and he will get into that more further in the tutorial as well. So I wanted to, I'm going to switch again back to the, actually, there we go. So I wanted to talk again really quickly. Does anybody have, I'm going to talk about version control and then ask Jared or any of the rest of you guys to jump in on this idea that we're often working in 2 different, it's almost like we have 2 separate apps going on. We've got our development and our production, but before we get to that, I want to talk about version control. Does anybody have any questions about Git and the purposes of Git? I know we talked about, if nobody has questions, there's no need to go into it too much because we talked about that last class, or Ramiro covered that. So everybody is fairly good with the idea that Git resides on your particular, your particular machine that you're working on. It's super. You can think of it kind of like the save as function in Word. Like you're getting to you're keeping track of your versions. As Ramiro said last time, and even a much better analogy even is for folks who've gotten used to using Google Docs now, or actually for folks who have Macs. I think the Pages or a lot of the programs in Macs automatically use version control too, where you're not, because on a Microsoft Word, if you were to just hit save, you're basically saving over everything you did, right, each time. So that's why version control using Git is much more like Save As or Google Docs or something, where it's actually keeping track of each commit, each instance, so that you can go back. You screw something up, you can go back to the last point where you know that it was working fine, even if it didn't have that last feature that you were trying to do and screwed everything up. And as Ramiro explained, you can also branch off and try to work on something else and then bring it back into your main code as well. And that kind of, and then you've got all that going on your machine. And then if you want to work, if you either want to share that with other people, work with another team, then it gets into, you're also pushing to a remote repository with, in this case, Bitbucket, but there's also GitHub, basically serving, either one is serving the same function. Everybody's got that. So then these tools are also part of what's allowing us to have these two separate environments that most people would be using when they're coding, a development versus a production environment. Jared, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So this is one of those things that's going to be very different for every environment that you work in. But it's pretty typical that you'll have these splits between development and production environments. For us, it's not as critical of a concept as it would be on a larger team. So let's, for a moment, imagine we're on a team that works on something more important or something that a lot of other people use. Let's say the real Twitter website, right? So they're going to have a huge database that holds all of the tweets that people have sent out. And if you are doing development and testing out new features or functions, or maybe you're testing out a new way to read the information out of the database to see if it's faster than it was before, you definitely don't want to be doing that against the actual live information on the Twitter site. Because you might, and in my first internship, I did something like this. You might have made a mistake in your code, or you might be working in an area of code that's writing or deleting things from the database, and I happened to delete the entire database that I was working on. Just wipe the whole thing out. And I got really nervous, and I told my boss, and he went, "Don't worry, you're not working on production. Just go tell them you need to reset your, QA database that you're working with." So that's one of the big reasons that you're working in that. But also at the same time, you just wouldn't be able to work with a data set as large as the entire Twitter database. You can't have that on your computer. It's too much information. There's too much going on. So what you need is a smaller sort of mock environment that is close to what the live application looks like, but easier to work with, and it's not going to be as complex, and you're not going to risk any real data. So that's what you're setting up with the development environment. Now in our case, that leads to some differences. For example, we're using a different database type in the development versus production, at least for what we've done so far. We're using I think it's SQLite or whatever it is for development, and then production on Heroku is using, I believe, Postgres is what's being used there. So they're slightly different databases, and there can be differences between them, but for the most part, it's just a way to have a lighter weight environment for you to do development and also to not risk deleting anything or affecting any of the real information.
Right. Yeah, I know. For me, one thing that has confused me so far, I've managed not to get confused in this tutorial, but in other small project, it's kind of funny. Like I'll use this tutorial as an example. You go through in chapter 2, you create an app that has, actually even simpler example. In chapter 1, you create an app that says "Hello World," right? And then you go through and you run Rails server, and we have to include that additional bit because we're in Cloud 9 on here. And so then we can look on an actual local web page in our browser, and we can see our Hello World app, right? But then we go and we're using Heroku to put it live on the internet, and that's our production site via Heroku. But anything that you do in the one does not affect the other, and it doesn't feel confusing to me, at least, when you're writing "Hello World" and then maybe you change one to say "Hola Mundo" or something like that just for fun, and it makes sense that they're two different things. But then once you start dealing with databases, always reminding yourself, at least for me, that you're not, like, I go through and I create a bunch of users in the course of testing out how my development app is working, and then I go to my Heroku and I'm like, what's going on? The whole thing's blank now. It's like it didn't work. That's something that for me I have to keep reminding myself. That's like where I realize, oh wait, I'm not actually thinking of these as two separate environments.
Right, that's a really good point.
Does anybody have any other questions about that? It can be, I think it can be, for me at least, again, it can be a little bit tricky to remember. Like if you forget and you haven't updated your production environment in a lot, you haven't pushed everything to Heroku, it can be a little tricky to remember exactly, like you have to go back and look all the things that haven't been pushed yet to your production, because a lot of it will be obvious just by looking at it. How do you usually, Jared? How do you usually go through and would you go into how do you see exactly what code is really the code that you're confirming what code is running your production environment? Is that by going into Bitbucket in this case and looking at your code?
No, I haven't done this, but you would log into Heroku and look at what your Heroku account says is running, because it's Heroku that's our production environment.
Right.
So I'll bet you the Heroku command line gives you some options to find out what's running and stuff like that. Basically, probably putting Heroku in front of some other commands will let you see things like what gems are there or what database might be used and some of that stuff. All of that is, customizable for your environment. So it's not something that's just necessarily a given that you'd be able to figure it out the same way for every environment that you're working in. It's going to be environment specific, or maybe you've written some code into your actual application so that there's a page in it that's reports back that environment information when you go to it. That's a pretty common way to do it as well. You'll code up a page in your application so I can just go there in whatever environment I'm in and it'll tell me the types of information that I'm looking for.
So there's not, as far as you know, there's not usually an easy way to literally see your entire app as the basis for your live production app, like the whole file structure and everything.
Like I say again, that's going to be environment specific. So I don't know what Heroku gives you access to go go see, right? If it's anything, it's probably going to look a lot like what your development environment is like, just structured maybe a little bit differently in terms of the file structure and where stuff sits.
Right.
At least the way we're writing this stuff right now, it will look very similar to it. But yeah, it would depend on what Heroku gives you access to, whether you can go into Heroku and actually see the file system and look at it and investigate it, which they may let you do.
Right. Yeah, I know I've tried, like from in the terminal using you can run the command Heroku logs and get some information that way. And I know that for people more skilled than I am, that is often sufficient to give them the information they need if there is any problem they can't pinpoint between the development and the production. Any other questions about that? No? Okay, so we've already talked about the other smaller topics that I felt might be good to hit. We've talked about gems just being these individual kind of packages of pre-written code. And then scaffolding, skip around a little, scaffolding, I'll admit, all I know is scaffolding makes things seem a lot easier, but so scaffolding is what's generated, what we generate in chapter 2 in order to get to go ahead and already have users. It's basically creating these big chunks of code that are where it's automatically using one command, right? It's creating big chunks of code going all different places. It's basically doing everything you need to have users or to have micro posts, which is what he's calling like tweets. Like tweets are like micro posts. So it's going ahead and creating the code you need to have the database structure. It's going ahead and having the code you need for it to show up as a little form. So it knows like the basic things that you'll need. So in that sense, scaffolding is very helpful. Running this very basic command, like Rails generate scaffolding, and then telling it what database type objects, what resource you want to create. But the flip side, as I think he's going to explain in later chapters, is that because it's kind of generic, what people tend to need for a certain thing, it's also creating a whole lot of unnecessary code. So usually, I think most people say good coders, if they were creating an app that they really wanted to use a lot, or they're doing it for a client, they would very rarely use scaffolding because the pain in the butt that's caused in having to go out and take out the unnecessary stuff, or simply to know really well what each line of code is doing that was generated is so hard that most people wouldn't do it that way. That it's better to go ahead and start from scratch and create all that without using a scaffolding command. And so that's why it then takes from chapter 3 through the end to do that. But it's pretty cool to be able to like create using scaffolding, you could create a usable app like he does. He basically creates, he doesn't quite get to the point where he gets us about halfway there in the toy app in chapter 2 with about another few hours worth of work. Or for a really seasoned programmer, a few minutes worth of work, you could have created basic Twitter already, which is pretty amazing. Does anybody have thoughts, questions about that?
I remember in our class you were saying that scaffolding is kind of, in essence, like a shortcut or a quick way of making like a mock-up to show to someone without having to take the time to do everything.
Right.
So that's still pretty much what it is, like just a quick.
Yeah, I think that's a legit use of it. It's kind of like if you really wanted to do just a short thing for a presentation, like you were doing a pitch and you hadn't made your app yet, you might use like some sort of wireframe, or you might basically not create something that was even functional, just create something that was pretty to look at and showed like what you imagine your user interface might look like. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you didn't mind that it didn't look pretty, but you just wanted to show the functionality really quick, then yeah, then the fact that you could create something that was functional using scaffolding would be pretty awesome.
Right.
Any other thoughts, questions on that?
I'd say another big benefit of scaffolding, especially when you're learning, is I talked about how one of the benefits from something like Rails is you're learning from the best experiences of other people. That includes that scaffolding, when you're running the scaffolding, it, for the most part, solves a lot of problems that seem like they're going to be very, very simple problems, but end up taking a lot of time. Like I was joking with a coworker today where I said, it's hilarious how it can literally take me an hour to figure out how to name something sometimes. I'm like, what should I name this function? Oh, I don't know. That's not the right name. I'm not sure how to get it correct. And so the scaffolding can help solve a lot of that because it names things and puts them in specific places that have already been defined. So you don't have to go and try and figure all that out. So while you may not end up building the whole application that way, it's also a really good way to get a quick understanding of how stuff's being structured, is to run the scaffolding tools and just see where it's putting things, because you'll probably structure stuff similarly, if not identically.
Right. Great idea. Anything else on that? I don't actually know whether this is, I'm manually switching the views. I'm a little confused as to what. I thought normally it just picked up whoever was talking, but whatever. So the last thing, well, we'll have, if anybody has questions or other things they want to talk about before we finish up, we can do that too. But the last thing I had on the list was, in some ways, one of the single biggest things is debugging. How do you how do you keep making progress when you get an error message? How do you fix it? And this is where I think most of you guys have probably already seen this in some context. A lot of people would say that, kind of jokingly say that being a good coder is really just being a good Googler. That not even somebody like Ramiro or Jared, who has a computer science degree and years of experience, every single day is running into things that either they just have never had to do before and don't know how to do, or thought they knew how to do, but now they've got an error message. So how do you handle that? And usually the answer is, well, if you have an error message, just copy and paste that error message or the kind of key part of it into Google and see what comes up. And you do that over and over again. I mean, the most important thing is just not giving up. You do that over and over again. You start to get much better, too, about identifying which are the best resources to go to, right? Like recognizing that usually the answers you find on Stack Overflow, because of the way it's structured, so Stack Overflow is a site that has, stackoverflow.com has answers to, it's where people go to ask these questions. It's kind of like Quora or a little bit like Wikipedia in the sense that it's crowdsourced knowledge about software development questions. And so if you can either just go straight there, or you can start by Googling, and oftentimes the best answers will still be from Stack Overflow as well. And so you can go through and try to find, oftentimes you'll find somebody with the exact problem you have, but if not, you can kind of reason by analogy and find something where somebody had something similar in a different type of app, and see how you would have to modify their answer to make it work in yours. Anybody have any good debugging tips or lessons that they've learned?
Don't always go with the first Stack Overflow answer. Sometimes the question can be asked maybe by like 4 or 5 different people, And it may be something small that each one is different. So you have to just actually go through the Stack Overflow answers and read the answers that they give. And some of the answers people give aren't always right either. So you have to make sure it's one that works with the user. And also there's a lot of people that have done the Hardle tutorial. So you'll see a lot of the answers or a lot of the questions that you're running into, someone might have already asked it, and it's under like Hardle and Stack Overflow or something like that. I think it's a whole Michael Hardle forum or something like that.
Oh, that's a good
I gotta find out. I think it's I gotta find it.
Yeah, if there's a forum specifically for questions about the tutorial in Stack Overflow or otherwise, those would be good to know about. I definitely find like the couple errors I've gotten so far, if I don't find something immediately by just Googling the error message, I'll throw Hardle in front of it too and see if I can pull up something where somebody has gotten that exact same message because they're working on this exact same app, which can be helpful. Kind of feels like cheating, but as a last resort. Anything, Jared? Any wisdom on debugging?
Debugging's hard.
Wisdom, not discouragement.
What?
Wisdom, not discouragement.
No, debugging is sort of an art, and debugging is so. Honestly, I love debugging hard problems, right? But recognize that you're going to go through frustrating moments when you're dealing with it too, and you get such a thrill of success when you finally make it through most of the time. Now, sometimes you get really frustrated because you realized, oh, that was something so simple. And it doesn't matter how long you've been programming, this isn't something that goes away. You're going to deal with problems. Some of them are just out of your hands. Some of them are your fault. I mean, just last week I spent 2 days just trying to figure out the source of a problem in our code. Getting up, going for walks, frustrated at times, and then finally pinpointed what was causing the problem. Now, I was dealing with something pretty complex in terms of what could be causing it and stuff, but it's going to be that way always. I definitely recommend one of the first things you do when you encounter a problem is to try Googling it. You see an error message, Google the error message. It doesn't mean you're going to get the right answer, but don't do it immediately. Try and figure out if there's something obvious that you did. Always look back at your command and make sure you ran what you thought you ran, or the code is the correct code. You don't have a typo in it. But shortly after that, throw it into Google. Not just because they might have the answer for you, but because it'll help you also see how many other people are running into those same sorts of challenges. So you recognize that this isn't something that's unique to me. I'm not the only person who's had this problem or had a challenge with this. There's tons of other people encountering the same issue.
Right. Yeah, one other thing that is, one other big tip or tactic is, so if you have an error message, like say you're running your local server and you get an error message either there or in your production environment, and it's within the your browser, then you're the first thing I would do then is to Google that error message. But a lot of times you also get error messages in the terminal, and another thing that's really helpful in the terminal is just, unfortunately, some smart people wrote all the messages you get in the terminal too, and oftentimes it'll tell you. Sometimes it'll even tell you, "Did you mean this?" And you can just follow the instructions that they've given you. Other times the answer when it's in the terminal is, again, to Google it, and it's a little bit more complicated because it can be, you're like doing a bundle install and there's a whole bunch of text and you have to find the kind of the operative words where it really, where things went wrong. And so it's a little bit trickier to find the right error message that you want to Google, but then from there it's the same. All right. Any other questions?
One thing I would say also with that, and I haven't tested this, but since we're using Cloud9, there's a big benefit there too, which is I highly doubt you're going to break your environment in such a way that it's going to have a permanent impact on your computer, right? You're probably not going to cause any long-term problems, so you can feel much more free to experiment and do something silly and see what happens, because you can reset the cloud in some way, I'm sure, to fix the problem versus causing an issue on your computer.
Right. Alrighty. Any other questions? Anyone wants to go over this class? Otherwise, we'll just probably finish up early. No? Everybody's good? So I'll admit that I haven't looked at chapter 3 closely enough to know if there's a good stopping point partway through it, but for folks who are not up to the end of chapter 2 yet, I mean, I would just keep working and try to get through the first 2 chapters at least, and take a look and take a stab at trying to start chapter 3. And then I would just generally, I mean, my advice would be just to try to get as far as you can. I wouldn't worry about, I don't think it's bad to get ahead. There's so many additional resources and things he suggests looking at on different topics that if you do get really ahead, you can take it even. I mean, I encourage you to look the first time at these additional resources too, but you can go back and look at some of them more carefully. So yeah, I would just keep plugging ahead and see how far you can get before Thursday.
And if you haven't been on the Slack, it's been pretty active with questions and answers and things. So if you have any questions or any issues you're running into, hop on there and ask away, and I'll bet you're going to get help from someone.
Yeah, yep, definitely ask questions and go on there and try to answer some too.
Yeah, do, please.
Yeah, it's a really good resource. Alrighty, any other questions? All right, thank you guys. See everybody on Thursday.
Later, Dan.
Later.